Hey everybody, welcome to another lesson about informal logic. And so in the first lesson we talked a little bit about what arguments are, and we outlined some aspects of arguments. And so right now I want to talk about a little bit more about propositions. So the components of an argument, another name for those components is propositions. Propositions is like a general term for premises and conclusions. So a proposition is just as we said in the last, a true or false statement. Now you might think that all sentences are true and false, but we'll find out that that's not the case. So let's think of some propositions. My grandma is dead. That's a proposition. And it's both true and false, interestingly enough, because I have one dead grandmother and one alive grandmother. It's sunny outside. That's a proposition. And actually right now, I'm in Southern California, and it's a true proposition. I love living here. It's crazy. I came here from Chicago. The weather is just crazy here. It's perfect. What are some other propositions? The moon is made of cheese. That's a proposition. Remember, propositions can be false, and so that would be a false proposition. We know that the moon is not made of cheese. But one can imagine a possible world where there would be a moon made of cheese. So this pen is black. That's a proposition, and that would be a true proposition. Now if I said to you, this pen is blue, that would also be a proposition, but it would be a false proposition. So remember, proposition is just the general term for a true or false statement. And so if we think of it in this sense, a proposition as like an overarching concept, propositions include both the premises and the conclusions of our arguments. So our premises and conclusions need to be propositions, true or false statements. Now we might not know the truth or falsity of a statement, but so long as it has the potential to be true or the potential to be false, that also counts. So for example, no one has proven that God exists. So if I were to say God exists, this is actually a proposition. Now some people might think this is false, and other people might believe this to be true. But right now there's no knockdown proof that shows us that God actually exists. But this statement is definitely either true or false. Either God does exist or God doesn't exist. One of those two options. And we'll all find out one day. Unless, I guess, we die and our consciousness ceases. Kind of like when we go to sleep and we dream, dark dreamless sleep. If that's what happens when we die, then we probably won't know whether or not God exists. Which probably would be the case. If God doesn't exist, then when we die, our consciousness just ceases, like when you get knocked out or when you fall asleep. Although maybe, yeah, anyway, we won't get into it. But anyway, this statement could be true, it could be false. And so even if we don't know the truth value of a statement, we can still know whether or not it could be true or false. So that counts as a proposition. All right, so let's talk about, there are some things that aren't propositions. And you might be thinking, well, isn't everything a proposition? And that's not the case. And we're going to talk about 3 instances here. The first sample of statements that's not a proposition, so meaning not a true or false form of sentence or statement. So these will be, we'll call these non-propositions. And the first form is a question. So let me just put one up here right now. What time is it? So a question is not a proposition because a question in itself is not true or false. So if we just look at this question, what time is it? Try to think in your head, is this true or false? Probably as you think about it, your brain is kind of like, right? Precisely because that statement doesn't have a truth value. Now, if I said to you, Justin asked me what time is it, then it would be a proposition. Because when I say Justin asked me what time is it, I've actually created a sentence that's either true or false. But if you just look at a question by itself, what time is it? How old are you? What time are we going to the bar? How many Grammys have you won? Anything like that, just as a question, doesn't have a truth value, so it's a non-proposition. The second type of statement or sentence that's not a proposition is an exclamation. Watch out, right? And this one is actually kind of like a command, right? You're telling someone to watch out, but watch out in and of itself, or if somebody says, ow, right? That's neither true nor false. Now, it might be the case that it's true that my cousin told me to watch out. If I take that entire sentence, that's a proposition. My cousin told me to watch out, because it's either true or false. But if somebody just says to you, watch out, or wah, right, ow, it's not a proposition because it doesn't have any truth value in itself. And the third thing that's not a proposition is a command. So if somebody says to you, stop crying in the shower about your life and how miserable you are, that would be not a proposition because it's a command. If somebody tells you to shut the door, that's not a proposition, it's a command. So anything that's a question, an exclamation, or a command, notice that watch out is actually kind of a mixture of an exclamation and a command. These are non-propositions, and the reason why they're not propositions is because they don't have a truth value. They're neither true nor false. So let's recap. Propositions are statements that are either true or false. All of the things that we evaluate in arguments are going to be propositions. So our premises, our reasons, and then the conclusion is also going to be a proposition. We don't want to evaluate these things if they're included inside of arguments. Now, inside of an argument, you might see a question. Sometimes people ask rhetorical questions when they're giving arguments. For example, if somebody's presenting an argument for the existence of God, they'll often use a technique called shifting the burden of proof to support their own position, or appeal to ignorance would probably be a better. So they might say something like, well, can you prove that God doesn't exist? So notice that's a question. Can you prove that God doesn't exist? Now, that in no way supports their position, right? So if I believe that God exists and I say to you, well, can you prove that God doesn't exist? It has nothing to do with my argument, and it should not be included when I evaluate the argument. If someone else were evaluating my argument, they wouldn't want to include that statement, that sentence, because it doesn't have a truth value. And on a side note, it's also called appeal to ignorance when you say, for example, well, you can't prove God doesn't exist, therefore God does exist. That's not a good proof. It's called appeal to ignorance. The mere fact that you can't prove something is not the case doesn't mean that it automatically is the case. And here's an example that brings it out more clearly. If I tell you that I have a little gremlin, an invisible gremlin in my stomach who's jumping around on an invisible pogo stick, and then you say to me, well, how can you prove that there's an invisible gremlin in your stomach jumping around on an invisible pogo stick? And I say to you, well, you can't prove that there isn't an invisible gremlin jumping around on an invisible pogo stick in my belly. Does that mean Does that in any way support my claim that there is? No. So just because I appeal to the fact that you can't prove that it's not the case doesn't mean that it necessarily is. So just because you can't prove that dinosaurs don't exist doesn't mean that they do. And again, that's an informal logical fallacy called appeal to ignorance. But going back to this, if you see a question, an exclamation, or a command, if somebody tells you, believe in God, that's not part of an argument. It's just a command. It has no truth value, so we can't evaluate it in relation to the premises and conclusions in an argument. So it's important to be able to see these things in arguments, and then if you see this in the middle of an argument, then in your brain you can just cross it out, and then you can focus on the other propositional content that supports the conclusion. Okay? So, again, one last time, propositions are true or false statements, declarative sentences. Non-propositions are statements, or are sentences in our English language that don't have a truth value, a truth content. The three that we talked about here are questions, exclamations, and commands. And so as we move forward now into analysis of the different types of arguments, inductive and deductive, we'll probably come back to these themes. I'll probably include a few of these inside the arguments and try and catch you, right? So keep an eye out. Remember, questions, exclamations, and commands are not propositions. So until next time, I will see you soon. Bye.